Hello everyone, and thank you so much for visiting the library today to learn about a fascinating figure whose actions influence the history and culture of the Great Lakes and beyond. We're happy to welcome author Mike Nagle to showcase their biography of Eber Ward. It's called The Forgotten Iron King of the Great Lakes. Mike is a professor of history and political science at West Shore here in Scottsville. He's also the author of Justice S. Stearns, the Michigan Pine King and Kentucky Coal Baron, which won the Kentucky History Award. Please continue to enjoy refreshments and be sure to stop by the table if you haven't already to purchase any of Mike's two wonderful works. A special thank you to the Friends of the Library for helping to greet us this evening and for just showing happy faces around the library. And make sure to also grab a copy of our flyer that's highlighting some of the events that are going on here during the holiday season, including our New Year's Eve party, which will have fun for all ages, but also include kind of a new event this year that's a scavenger hunt for all of the adult attendees. And look forward to a variety of adult events here at the library in the coming months. All right, and we can welcome Mike.
Now, I wasn't sure if I needed the microphone or not, but sometimes it can be easier if I have it. Would you prefer that? Does that seem okay? Okay, all right. I'm seeing some nodding of heads. All right. Well, let me just kind of begin by saying thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. My family has come here to this library for years. I remember story time when my daughters were growing up, and we just loved it. Where's Miss? There she is, Miss Sue, back there. And so, you know, this building has just meant so much to my family. So I really, really appreciate the invitation and for you to come out tonight. So I teach at a community college, and so in theory, the students all want to be there. In theory, okay. And so you came out this evening. It's dark, it's winter, it's a little slippery on the road, so thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate that. Okay, do you think you could turn off the lights in the front? So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about Eber Ward, and maybe I can tell a little bit about the journey too associated with the book. Oh, and I forgot my copy. Just one second. My copy has some cheat sheeted spots. So if I read a little bit, I better have that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the journey, so to speak, with the writing and that, because, you know, as several people have said to me, boy, it must take a lot of time, it's a lot of effort and things like that to write a book, and absolutely, yes, it is. But history can still be fun. Yeah. Okay. And so one of the things that my wife and I have done is that we really like to travel, and so I was able to travel a lot and associate that with some of the research. And I need to thank West Shore Community College and the Board of Trustees who sponsored a sabbatical for me that allowed me to do a lot of research. The coolest thing that I did on this trip, just in terms of being able to do the research, involved a trip to Belgium. And I met a real live princess. So I'll talk more about Eber Ward's daughter, but she married a prince from Belgium. And so I was able to go and visit Chimay Castle on the left, and I met Princess Elspeth, who was 92 years old and when I met her. After the tour, you know, they were able to see if she could meet with me. And so just a little bit from the book. And I need these. Yes, that's right. It's not every day a person has the opportunity to meet a real live princess. In the fall of 2018, my wife and I traveled to Belgium to visit Chimay Castle as part of the research for this book. And we met Princess Elsbeth. She took the time to chat with us personally and answer a series of questions about Eber Ward's daughter, Clara, who was married to a previous prince of Chimay. Clara led a scandalous life, and her marriage to the Prince of Chimay ended in divorce. When I asked Princess Elsbeth about Clara, she declared, "We don't talk about her." The family did not appreciate the way she behaved. She was very pretty, but admitted that she was fast. And so I was with, they spoke French, is their original language, Flemish and French. And I kind of looked at the person that I was with and I was like, fast. I'm trying to interpret what that means here as an American, and that, and I was like, does it mean the same in Belgium? And she was like, yes. And so that just convinced me that I just needed to do more research, okay? And that just how compelling this story really was. The next great trip that my wife and I took was to Bois Blanc Island. Bois Blanc Island, okay, is it with the spelling? Which is very near Mackinac Island if you're not familiar with it. The reason why we went there is because Eber Brock Ward's father was the lighthouse keeper there he was there for several years, but Eber spent 2 years with his father there as his assistant. And so we went to Bois Blanc Island. All right, and has anybody here ever been there? It's very primitive. It's wonderful. So we got on our mountain bikes and we went out to Lake Anne. We knew that was kind of where it started, and I had heard that it was kind of a rough trip out there. And right when we were going beyond the lake, we ran into someone. And he said, and we said, yeah, we're going out to the lighthouse. And they really discouraged us. And I said, yeah, but I'm writing this book. And he's like, really? And I was telling him about it. And he said, well, my grandmother was the lighthouse keeper. And I mean, can you believe that it's something like that was just so neat. And he said, now just make sure that you take a left here and you go right there. Well, I don't know how well you can see this, but the trail looked like this. Okay, a lot of water. And then we were just about ready to turn around because we had already gone 45 minutes or close to an hour when we saw this sign that said "Keep out." And then we were able to go to the shoreline, and that is the current lighthouse. And so it was just really neat. That's one of two really neat adventures associated with the research involved with the book. On the left here you see a painting of Eber Brock Ward. This is huge. It's about 10 feet tall, and Eber Brock Ward dominates the canvas just as he dominated the business and industry and in many ways politics in the state of Michigan as well as throughout the Great Lakes during his lifetime. And I've got some quotes here from some contemporaries who commented about Eber Brock Ward. One described him as a man who was mild and agreeable. He was open-hearted and he was generous. And another said that he was selfish, devoid of a conscience. He was tyrannical, vindictive, and aggressive. And he engaged in illegitimate schemes. So as I talk about Ward, maybe you can think about how you would evaluate him and just try to determine which of those quotations you think best fits his activities in that. So Ward was actually born in Canada. His parents were from Vermont. He was born Christmas Day, 1811. We see a drawing of his father there. And he was born just outside of Toronto. His parents moved around a lot when he was little, and so they were only in Canada for a short time. This was right on the eve of the War of 1812. So shortly after his birth, he moved back into the United States. Tragedy struck the Ward family. When Eber was 6 years old, the plan was that they were going to move from the New England states down to Kentucky because his dad had spent some time there. Well, while they were on this journey, his mother died. And so he was only 6 years old at the time. And rather than continue on to Kentucky, they ended up moving to Michigan because Eber's brother had already settled there. And so that was actually very fortunate because Eber would then have a major impact on the history of the Great Lakes and the state of Michigan as opposed to the South. One thing I wanted to mention is that Eber's father really saw Kentucky as a great opportunity for the family, yet he was very uncomfortable with slavery. What we're going to see is that Eber's father describes slaveholders as blasphemous and hypocrites. And so Eber would pick up on this, particularly after his 2 years with his father, and he would also be very much against slavery throughout his lifetime. In case you're unfamiliar with the area where Eber ended up growing up, he grew up in Marine City, and so the arrow is pointing to Marine City there. At the time Eber was alive, it was known as Newport, but that's where he maintained his formative years. Was at Newport, and they moved there because Eber's uncle was already there, and his uncle was named Samuel. Samuel was already a successful businessman, and he had several boats. He would eventually have a fleet of vessels. Eber began working for his uncle Samuel at the age of 11 as a cabin boy on one of his vessels. And so basically he was just kind of doing lots of different errands. He would do whatever was necessary, whatever his uncle wanted him to do. And he worked for his uncle periodically after that, but he didn't work full-time for his uncle until 1932 when he was in his early 20s. He started off as his uncle's protege. He eventually became his uncle's partner. And they had a huge fleet of vessels on the Great Lakes. But I think a little context is helpful here. 1830s, what's going on in Michigan, what's going on in the country. So Michigan became a state, entered the Union as a state in 1837. Throughout the 1830s, Michigan experienced a tremendous amount of population increase. And you can see the numbers there. And as far as this map goes over here, so obviously this is the blue shows the territory or the state of Michigan. Originally, all of this was part of Michigan territory, but when Michigan became a state, it included the Upper Peninsula as well as Lower Peninsula. If we have questions afterwards, we can talk about the Toledo War, but maybe not right now. But anyway, so you can see some of these figures here. Just a population explosion in the 1830s, and Michigan was seen as a frontier where people could experience some economic prosperity. I think everyone is familiar with the Oregon Trail and people being on getting wagons pulled by oxen and going westward. And there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of times what people would do is they would get on a steamboat. And they would travel partially on a steamboat and then get a wagon and go further westward. Some people maybe had the idea of going all the way to the west coast, maybe not in the 1830s, but by the 1840s and 50s. But then they saw the opportunity in Michigan, and so many people ended up staying in Michigan. I mentioned that Samuel had a large fleet of vessels. This is just an example of the number of ships that they had in this arsenal, I guess you could say. This is the inventory from 1852, and so you see that these at the top here, just about every year a brand new ship was built. And then in 1849, there's a couple that are built. 1851, there are 3. And so Samuel and Eber were doing very well. Sam was more conservative than Eber was. And so the image on the right here shows the very first steamboat that the two had. And before Eber came to work for Samuel full-time in 1832, he only had sailboats or schooners. Okay? Beginning in 1830, beginning in the 1830s, Eber probably convinced his uncle that steamboats were the future. And so the very first steamboat that they had was the Huron, shown there. And as you see, by 1852, there's a ton of additional vessels. Eber's family life. What we'll see is that it was actually very tragic. He will be a horrible husband and a horrible father. And his family life was not positive at all. But I do like to look at this painting, or excuse me, this photo. This is possibly the oldest photo from the state of Michigan, produced in the state of Michigan, and it's from about 1842. On the left, you see Eber, and he's next to it. Maybe if I go like this, you can see it a little bit better. All right, so I think you can see that just a little bit better there. So notice he's got a book in his hand. He's got an image of a steamboat. He's wearing a suit. He's got his hair parted on his left. One eye is squinting a little more than the other. But the image that he's trying to portray here is, hey, I'm a successful businessman. You don't want to mess with me. If you cross me, what we'll find out is that if you cross Eber Ward, you don't do well. And so that's the image that he's trying to portray here with this photo. Now, if I can go, yeah. This is his wife, Polly. They were married in 1837. Okay. The only thing that we see other than Polly is the infant child. Okay. She is the epitome of what was expected for a woman in this era. She was supposed to run the household and she was supposed to raise the children. And that's the image that she's portraying here in this photo. What's interesting to me is that they didn't have a family photo with everyone together. I don't know if this foreshadowed the fact that they would eventually be divorced or not, but they decided to have their photos taken separately rather than together. Polly was actually the niece by marriage of Samuel. So Samuel's wife was named Elizabeth. Elizabeth had a sister, and Elizabeth's sister had some children. Okay, and that's the daughter. One of them is one child of that marriage was Polly, and so Eber knew her growing up. They were not blood relatives, but they had known each other since they were very young. And so she was Samuel Ward's niece by marriage. Does that make sense? Okay, so they weren't blood related, but they were, I guess you could say, cousins. Okay, apparently kissing cousins. Yes, particular case. The couple would be married for 30 years. They would have 8 children, and 7 lived to adulthood. Again, here we see another image, another drawing of one of Eber's vessels, and Samuel's vessels. This is called the Reindeer. One thing that I like about this is that not only were they involved in shipping, transporting people, but they also transported goods from the Great Lakes eastward or eastward to different parts of the Great Lakes. And so the sign here says this is Eber Ward's warehouse. So they had a huge warehouse where they would keep those goods. By the 1840s and 50s, it was clear that they had one of the largest operations on the Great Lakes. And in 1854, Samuel Ward died. And he would leave the bulk of his estate to his protege, who had become his partner, Eber. Now, I want to take a step back here for a second and say, if any research dealing with Eber Brock Ward needs to begin at the Burton collection, which is part of the Detroit Public Library. Has anybody here ever been there? It's wonderful. It's got a lot of great stuff. And so there's Eber's correspondences there, like letters to and from him and his sister and other members of his family. There were also several ledger books. One thing that was wonderful that I found out is that the original handwritten letters are located in Detroit at the Burton Collection. At CMU, they had the letters transcribed. That was so much easier. Trying to read 19th century letters is difficult, in handwriting and that, and so it was wonderful that CMU had those transcribed. But here we see the joint holdings kind of on the eve of Samuel Ward's death in 1854. And by 1852, their assets were worth well over $500,000. Translated to today's money is what, $17.5 million. And I mean, it's just kind of neat to see the ledger entries, with that. Even though the handwriting can be difficult to read, but you can see it says E.B. Ward's and Sam's property owned on equal joint account. That confirmed to me, I was like, when is it? Were they really partners or not? But it says it right there. They're owned equally, jointly. And so that was really cool to be able to come to that conclusion there. All right, so Eber has been with his uncle. He's partnered with him in the shipping industry, but he didn't stop there. Eber was very interested in expanding his business empire. So even while his uncle was still alive, he began to invest in the iron and what would have become the iron and steel industry. In 1853, he founded the Eureka Iron Company just outside of Detroit in Wyandotte, Michigan. They would produce a range of items, but arguably one of, if not the leading industry in the United States in the 1850s, and particularly after the Civil War, would be the railroad industry. And so iron rails were products as they were building more and more railroad tracks. They needed a lot of iron, and so he got into that industry. By 1860, he's the largest employer in the state of Michigan. The Wyandotte facility has a payroll after the Civil War of $20,000 a month. And that's just at Wyandotte in that particular facility. And on the left, you see, this is a transcription, but you see the Articles of Association for the company itself when it was founded. But Eber didn't just become involved in the iron and steel industry there. He had a facility in Chicago, the North Chicago Rolling Mill Company, right on the eve of the Civil War in many ways. All right, and it eventually had the latest technologies there, and over 500 employees. And he also had a facility in Milwaukee. So here, Eber Ward was initially involved in the one industry, transportation, shipping and that. But then he's involved in iron and steel, and not just in the state of Michigan, because he's got a facility outside of Detroit, one in Chicago, and another in Milwaukee. And so these eventually, these would eventually employ hundreds of people, and it would produce tons and tons of iron rails and other items. But it doesn't stop there. Okay? Arguably, his greatest triumph in this industry was that if you've ever heard of the Bessemer system of producing steel, Eber Ward's facility at Wyandotte was the first in the United States to use the Bessemer method. They produced it there. It was in his Chicago facility that the first steel rails were produced the following year. But they've got a nice historical marker in Wyandotte. While this is all great, and Eber's he's very successful in a couple of different industries, he's a tough guy to work for. Okay, he hated unions. He always wanted to keep his costs low, and the easiest way to keep your costs low is to focus on labor costs. And so not only did Eber try to keep wages as low as possible, he also tried to control aspects of their private lives. He did not support alcohol. During his lifetime, he probably never smoked. He never chewed tobacco. He never drank any alcohol. And he wanted others to maintain that type of a lifestyle as well. He didn't want any of his employees drinking, or on the job, of course, but also he didn't want them coming home or coming to work hungover. And so There's a great thing in the Ludington newspaper that says if you go to a ward camp and you're found having having had alcohol, or if you're bringing alcohol, you're fired immediately. Ward considered those unions to be wrong and tyrannical. He started to have labor difficulties, particularly after the Civil War. Civil War is boom times. There's lots of steel being produced. Then there was a bit of a lag after that as demand dropped, and so he started to have some labor problems at that point. But he also, and so by the way, at one point in the early 1870s, Eber Ward is labeled the Iron King of the West by the Chicago Tribune. So it's just a key figure. But he didn't stop there. Okay. So he was also involved in railroads. And for us here in Ludington, he's really crucial because he was the president of the Flint and Pere Marquette Railroad, which is the railroad that connected to Ludington. And he served as president from 1860 to his death in 1875. Now, it started in Monroe, Michigan, all right, and then continued, like here's the Saginaw, and then it made its way finally to Ludington in 1874. And so that was crucial for the city of Ludington that we would have a railroad coming this way. And we've also got Bruce Masinski here from the Lake County Historical Society, and I think the city of Baldwin has a connection there in the name for that. Okay. Baldwin was he superintendent? I couldn't remember what his position was, but he was associated with the railroad.
He was associated.
Yeah, and so that's where Baldwin got its name.
Yeah, well, Baldwin was named for the governor.
Oh, is that right? Okay, thank you. Okay.
The state capital was Governor Baldwin.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that. Yeah. So the Flint and Pere Marquette was a land grant railroad. That meant for every mile of track that they built, they would get 6 square miles of land. That was designed to offset the cost, and also to once the railroad had that land, they could sell it, and then people would be moving westward along the railroad tracks. Just as a side note, for every mile at this time, for every mile of track, it was 6 square miles of property that the railroads received. Later legislation for the Transcontinental Railroad would be 20 square miles for every mile of track that was built. By 1874, the Flint and Pere Marquette reaches Ludington. But there's a little bit of conflict with James Ludington and Eber Brock Ward. James Ludington was a leading lumber baron in this area, and he owned the best sites for sawmills on Pere Marquette Lake. Eber Brock Ward owned 70,000 acres, some 70,000 acres of land on either side of the Pere Marquette River. And so that was great, but he needed a sawmill site in order to try to, to cut down the trees and then to transform the timbered property into 2x4s and other things, for construction. And the property that Ward had was really valuable, and James Ludington knew it. And so the two entered into a negotiation, and one of those nice trips that I went was to New York. Okay. I did research during the day because at the New York Historical Society, the Ludington family papers are located there. And I was able to read a lot of the correspondence between James Ludington and his family. My wife went to art museums and things like that during the day, and as I was doing research. And then at night we went to shows. It was great. History can be fun, okay? All right. So what I learned from the correspondence was that James Ludington said to his brother, "Hey, we just need to hold off because what we want to do is not sell Ward this property. Instead, we want to get Ward's timbered property, because if we do, it will be among the best property in the West." And so he just was dragging it on, wouldn't negotiate, and Eber Ward had enough. So it turns out that some of James Ludington's men trespassed on Eber Ward's property and cut down some of his trees. Ward found out about it, but he didn't do anything. He waited until James Ludington came to his town, to Detroit, and he had him arrested. Suddenly, James Ludington decided that he would sell the property that Eber Ward had wanted. And so Eber Ward ends up building 2 sawmills on Pere Marquette Lake, and he becomes the largest producer of lumber in this area. So where was this? Well, if you know where OxyChemical is today, right at the end of Washington Avenue, that was the North Mill. Okay, here, and then where, Pure Point condos are located, okay? That was the other mill that Eber Ward had. And while Eber Ward, he lived in Detroit, and he visited Ludington, but he was an absentee owner in this area. I think is it Beacon Funeral Home on South Washington? All right, so that was actually Eber Ward's home. His son had it built, and his son operated some of the facilities here for a while, but Ward only came occasionally. But that was Eber Ward's home, owned by him. And it was built in 1871, 1872, but Eber would die just within a couple of years. But so there's a little historical marker outside of the building. And on the left, we see the South Mill, and that's what it looked like in its day. So, what's the secret to Eber Ward's success? Well, it was vertical integration. Because Eber Ward owned the land where the iron was mined. He owned those mines. And he owned the vessels to transport that iron ore to his iron and steel manufacturing plants. And once that iron ore was transformed into rails, well, he was the president of the railroad. And then he owned timbered property. He owned the sawmills as well as the vessels to transport the finished products, whether they were whether it was on water, on the ships, or whether it was by rail. So this approach to vertical integration was undertaken decades before Andrew Carnegie. And as one person put it, I'd like to take credit for this quote, but as one person said to me, he said, he was Carnegie before there was Carnegie. So I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah.
By the way, just one other note is that Ward's Chicago facility, the North Chicago Mill, would eventually be part of Carnegie's steel. And one of the foundations for it. So, that's Eber, okay? All right, and a lot of his business activities in that. Eber's most important relationship throughout his entire life was with his sister. She's shown here. This is Emily. When Eber's mother died, Eber was 6. Emily was 9. Emily, in many ways, took over the role of a mother type of figure for all of her siblings. So she became an adult, do I dare say, at a very young age. They were very close. Emily never married throughout her entire lifetime, but she cared for her sister's children. Both of her sisters died young, and so she helped to raise them. And Emily's lifelong goal was to operate a school, and she wanted to work with children, and so for 20 years she operated what was known as Newport Academy. And another one of the trips that my wife and I had was to Marine City, and the building, the Newport Academy, is still standing. It houses the Marine City Pride and Heritage Museum. They've got a lot of great stuff there. And so Marine City's really a neat town. If you've never been, it's a nice trip. But what was interesting about Emily's Newport Academy is that she ran it she ran it with an iron fist, just as her brother ran his businesses, because she hired all the teachers. She developed all the curriculum. She was the principal. She was the Board of Education, and she had original jurisdiction if somebody had a complaint. And she had appellate jurisdiction, if somebody wanted to appeal her decision at any time. And so she really took that and she controlled that for about 20 years. Eber provided the funding, she provided the leadership at the school. Politically, Eber Ward was a Whig, and then he was a Republican. He was a strong member of the Republican Party, and he was, and I mentioned before that he was very much against slavery. In the 1850s, a mini civil war broke out in Kansas. It was called Bleeding Kansas, as the question of whether or not slavery would expand into Kansas ripped the country apart in many ways. Particularly in that area. There were supporters of slavery who flocked to Kansas. There were opponents of slavery who flocked there as well. And demonstrating and put his money where his mouth was, he donated $10,000 to this anti-slavery cause in the mid-1850s. Additional activities demonstrate his opposition to slavery. So he was one of his employees described him as a radical on the issue of slavery. And he, when this employee was first hired, Ward spoke with him and he said, okay, if there's a runaway slave that comes here and is trying to get to Canada, through the Great Lakes, you're not supposed to charge them. They're allowed to be on one of these ships for free, and you should hide them in this aft compartment so that nobody sees them, nobody's aware of it, and they can get away for free, to freedom, I should say, to Canada. And so 3 of his vessels were linked to the Underground Railroad, and there's an advertisement here on the left for the Forest Queen, which was one of those vessels. In one particular case, there was a group of runaway slaves that, and their owner or slave catchers were right behind them. They were able to get onto the ship, and the slave catchers also were able to be there. And Eber happened to be on the ship that day. And so he was told what was happening, and he said, okay, this is what we're going to do. He had the captain go out to the neutral waters, because they weren't going right to Canada. They were in neutral waters, and they stopped, and they put a rowboat down. And he said, okay, let the slaves then row to freedom into Canada. And he also made sure that each of them had $1 so that they would be able to buy some food and whatnot once they got to Canada into freedom. And so that's just an example of Eber and his actions in the anti-slavery movement. After during the California Gold Rush, there was a lot of wealth that a lot of people had acquired, and so and Eber was very negative at times with his comments, saying, "Oh, these people are just flashing their wealth around, and just think of all the poor people who could have been fed with this." Well, he then succumbed to the excesses of the time period that he lived, because his correspondence shows that he would say, money doesn't buy you happiness and things like that. Yet, look at his mansion. This was located on 4th Street in Detroit. It unfortunately has been torn down because it was a very valuable piece of property. But it shows that while he spoke on one side of his mouth and when he was younger about not having the excesses of too much money, he worked tirelessly again and again and again, leaving his family behind to build an empire so that he could have things like this. I mentioned before, I kind of hinted at the fact that his family life was unsatisfactory. On the left, we see Polly, his first wife. They were married for 30 years. Had 8 children, 7 reached adulthood. After 30 years of marriage, he divorced Polly, and he married Catherine Lyon, who's shown on the right, and she was 30 years younger than him. And so what we would now refer to as a so-called trophy wife, okay, all right, it demonstrates he was a horrible husband. He had affairs. His relationship with Catherine started before his marriage or his divorce was finalized. And he was an absent father. Eber and Catherine would eventually have 2 children themselves. So you see that here. Here, Eber was clearly the state's leading businessman. Okay, he was the leading employer beginning in 1860. Because he was working so hard, I would argue that's a major factor, is that when he was 58, he suffered a stroke. But he was able to recover within about a month or so, and he went right back to the same level of work. In 1873, there was a so-called financial panic. Today, we call them depressions or recessions. Okay, an economic downturn. In the 1900s, in the 1800s, 19th century, they called them panics. There was the Panic of 1819, Panic of 1837, Panic of 1857, Panic of 1873. And in this particular case, what had happened, and I love this line from a historian, he said, there were too many railroad lines chasing too little traffic. And so it led to a bust in the railroad industry. And just think about it, if your main customer is the railroad because you're producing iron and steel rails, they stop selling them, or they stop buying them. And so it really hurt him hard financially. And eventually he would suffer a second stroke in early January of 1875, and he died at the age of 63. Now, one thing I would like to point out here, again, I made several trips to Detroit in that Burton Historical Collection. And here you see some, handwritten letter. Okay, this was not in the CMU collection. So I'm reading along, I'm tired, my eyes are kind of glossing over, and I'm reading this letter, and Eber says, yeah, I feel okay, but I just can't sleep very well, and it's a letter to Emily, his sister. He's like, do you need any money? Because I can probably give you some, I just don't have a lot, and so he writes this letter. And I was like, oh, well, this is interesting, and so I looked at the date. And I looked at it, and I was like, oh, that's kind of hard to read, but it looks like it's July 2nd, 1875. Okay? And so I read it, read the letter again, and I would transcribe it myself, and I thought, wait a minute. He died in January of 1875. And so what this was, and I had noticed this earlier, is that a lot of times, instead of writing out, the abbreviation for January was Jany, Jany. And I thought that it was July, okay? But then I thought, wait a minute. He wrote this letter to his sister the day he died. And so it was just one of those aha moments where, when you're like, I've been working on this for 4 years, and I wonder if I'm going to get anything good. And you just wonder about it. No, really, honestly, it's like that. It's drudgery. And then I find out that he wrote this thing the day he died. He finished, in my mind, he finished the letter, then he put on his overcoat, and he went to go to court, and he was walking along the street, fell over, and he died. Now, whether or not this was the last letter, I don't know, but I like to think that it was. So, the state's richest man probably in all of the Great Lakes, well, all of the Midwest. Okay, he dies. It turns out that his estate was worth over $5 million. The family fought over the money. And it was a big fight between the children from Eber's first marriage, because, by the way, his wife died. His first wife had died. Okay, they divorced, and within a few months, his first wife died after the divorce. So there was a fight between Eber's children from his first marriage and his second wife, okay, Catherine. And it was crazy. This made national headlines. This is a headline from the New York Times. The extraordinary revelations in the trial for the Ward-Will case. Ward was accused of being under the undue influence of his second wife, and that he was going crazy because of his support for spiritualism. Now, in the years particularly after the Civil War, as a lot of family members lost young men in their prime fighting in the Civil War, they wanted to maintain a connection with them. And there was a huge increase in the interest of spiritualism, so that, to try to communicate with those who had passed away. So Mary Todd Lincoln had seances at the White House. Horace Greeley, the journalist, he attended seances. I'm trying to think of, there were many, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Eber Ward attended many seances. My take on it is that he found them interesting and a form of entertainment, but that he was not, I don't think he wasn't going there to find out if he should invest more money in this facility or that facility and to make business meetings or business decisions, but he was portrayed in that way. Well, the first trial over Eber Ward's estate ended in a hung jury, and right on the eve of the second trial, they settled out of court. And it turns out that Catherine Ward ended up getting the Ludington properties without having to pay any debt. His kids ended up getting everything else. And it turns out that Catherine Ward made a killing on it, and because she didn't have any of the debts associated with his estate. And for about a year, his businesses operated, and there was a power vacuum because he had passed away, and he had always paid really close attention to things, and he wasn't there anymore. And so the value of his estate actually shrunk quite a bit. But Catherine, because she didn't have any of the debts to have to pay, she did really well. And she had plans for the money. They had money. She decided she wanted her daughter to marry royalty. She wanted a title for the family. So Clara is shown here on the right. And when she was 2 years old, that's when her dad died, when Eber died. In 1890, at the age of 16, shortly before her 17th birthday, she married Prince Joseph, a prince from Belgium. She was called a dollar princess. She wasn't the first American from a wealthy family to marry into royalty in Europe, but she had the money, and the Chimay Castle was in need of repairs to the tune of about $300,000. And so she provided her dowry of $300,000. And the Chimay Castle got a big upgrade. And they appeared to be happy for about 5 years, until Clara and her husband, the prince, went to France, and they saw this Hungarian violinist. And within a few weeks, Clara would leave her prince, and she would take off, divorce her prince, and eventually marry Rigo. And so on the right, you see a newspaper entry from the Ludington newspaper, and they were merciless. They're like, hey, you married a prince, you're a princess, you should be really happy, you've left your prince? No, she was gone with the gypsy. And so they were very critical. And for a time, it appeared as if she was cut off from the family wealth, and so she sold her image to sell cigarettes on the left. She also sold bicycles and many things, and so to make money. And then on the middle there, that's a postcard. So she sold postcards, but she also was involved in entertainment. And her skill as an entertainer was to wear a bodysuit that simulated nudity and to stand. Sometimes while her husband Rigo, the violinist, played his violin, sometimes it was by herself. And so she was. So if Ward was Carnegie before there was Carnegie, all right. Clara Ward was Paris Hilton before there was Paris Hilton. Okay, all right. So, yeah. So on the right we see, oh, by the way, just to let you know, Clara's was just so fun to learn about. So she married the prince, divorced him after 5 years, marries Rigo, they go all over Europe, spend lots of money, she leaves Rigo, she marries somebody else. She's with this gentleman for a short time, and then she leaves him, and then marries somebody else. What I would argue is I'm really sympathetic to her, because here her mother forced her to marry someone when she's 16 years old, and most women stuck in a marriage that they don't like, especially in that time period, didn't have the resources to be able to leave their husbands. Well, she did. And she did whatever she wanted to do. Just as her father did what he wanted to do in the business world, she decided to live a life on her own terms. So on the right here, you see the family plot and the final resting place of Eber Ward and members of his family. In many ways, Eber's legacy is forgotten. The title of the book is The Forgotten Iron King. And Sean, I think, so this is Sean Henney. One of the things that I learned when it comes to writing is that writing is not a solitary thing to do. Good writing takes a lot of collaboration. And so Sean read every single draft of every single chapter. He's my colleague at West Shore. And Sean, I think you and I were just like throwing around some things with the title. And was it you and I think you, who said, I think I might have had forgotten in there, but we came up with that together? Does that?
You give me more credit than I deserve.
Yeah. Well, but anyway, I remember we were kind of going back and forth. And the publisher didn't like the word forgotten, but I really did. And so he really was forgotten. And he was forgotten because his employees didn't like him that much, because he tried to control their lives. The other business owners, like if they crossed him during his lifetime, he made sure that he would use harsh tactics in order to defeat any rivals, like James Ludington. Right? Catherine schemed to try to get access to his wealth after his death, and she used her energies, and all of the family's energies were involved in this fight over his estate, as opposed to trying to maintain Dad's legacy.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, his everything was liquidated in his businesses too. So the Ward name just fell off of a lot of those businesses, and Princess Clara. If there was any opportunity, Princess Clara just kind of took all the air out of the room, so to speak, if there had been any interest in Eber Ward, and so she just overshadowed her dad. So we're back here. One person says that he was a man of mild and agreeable manners, and he was open-hearted, generous guy. Another says he's selfish, tyrannical, illegitimate, vindictive. All right, so maybe he was both. That's what I would argue, okay? All right? So his generosity was seen with Newport Academy and funding that with his sister. But more importantly, I would argue, the most important moral issue of his day, the most important, was slavery. And he was on the right side. Okay? He strongly supported the Union. At one point, I didn't mention this, but at one point, there were several business owners who were saying, hey, we've got this tax on our incomes. During the Civil War, that was the first time that the federal government had done that on individuals and on businesses. And they said, this is way too high. And Ward said, no, this is a wartime measure. I will gladly pay my taxes. Now, as soon as the war was over, he wanted to get those taxes dropped, but as a wartime measure, he was strongly supportive of that. But he was also tyrannical toward his employees. If you crossed him, you would get hurt. And so I would argue, as you said, Katie, he was both, a little bit of both. Now there's one last thing that I would like to show here. This is the painting that's on the cover of the book. Okay? Just last week, I was in Detroit. Some of the fun things, this is after the book's out, okay? So one of the fun things that I got to do was I got to see the actual original painting. I was so excited to see it. And it's at the Detroit Historical Society. And so you can see that it's, you know, huge. It's a huge painting physically. So I've got the other, you know, image there too. That's just kind of fun. So that was the latest of the fun trips associated with the book. So what I tried to talk about this evening would be, on this day that shall live in infamy, I was going to say something about it being December 7th. Sorry, I forgot. I teach history. So you'd think I would have started off with that. But anyway, thank you so much for being here this evening and learning a little bit about this key figure in our state's history. Now, we might have time for a couple of questions. I don't want to go too late. How late is the library open? It's about 5 to 8, I think. I see just a couple of minutes to 8.
Okay.
It's also, I mean, I want to be respectful of people's time, but did anyone have any questions?
So you say that he owned, Flint and Pure Marquette owned a lot of it, just about all of Ludington, huh?
Well,
or a good portion of it?
So the Flint Pure Marquette Railway was, it owned a lot of property on either side of the railroad tracks, is usually where that property was. But they owned a lot in Mason County, Lake County, Newaygo County, and so it was a huge landowner. And I don't have it off the top of my head, but I mean it was one of the very large land grant railroads.
And then it was subdivided eventually.
Eventually, yes.
Because we bought a piece of property on Ferry Street.
Oh.
And in the way back in the records, I see that it was owned by a Funpia.
Is that right? Okay. So property on Ferry Street was owned by the Flint and Pure Marquette. I've actually had a range of people who've told me about, you know, looking back and the railroad owning the property. So, okay. Yeah. All right.
So Mike, you mentioned that he adopted the Bessemer method
Yes.
and other technological advances. Did he drive the innovation or did he just adopt it?
So he was not a scientist, but he was an organizer. So I would say he adopted it. Like he wanted to have the best facility, the most efficient, cut the costs and things like that. And so what he would do is he would find people who were experts and he would hire them himself. And so he was a great organizer as opposed to being like the scientist who knew exactly how to do that. So that would be the better way to think of it. Yeah.
So did you come across any information about whether or not he had any relationship with Lincoln at all during?
So I did read some of his correspondence with Abraham Lincoln, and that was really cool. The one thing that I would say is like in 1860, shortly after Lincoln's election, he wrote him a letter, and one of the things that he said in it was, make sure, and I'm paraphrasing, it's actually in the book, but anyway, I'm paraphrasing, he says, make sure that you don't get assassinated. Yeah, and just like, you know, really quite a bit of a foreshadow there. And publicly, he wrote many editorials and published pamphlets in support of the Republican Party in general and Abraham Lincoln in particular. And by the way, just one other thing when it comes, you know, he was very much against slavery. After the Civil War, the issue of whether or not African American men should have the right to vote was a big issue. And eventually it became part of the Constitution with the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870. Eber Ward's newspaper, the one that he owned, or in part with some other partners, had several editorials in support of the 15th Amendment. So he supported the right to vote for black men as well. Interestingly enough, he did not support the right to vote for women. And another editorial that ran in the paper was, when I read this, I was just like, oh my gosh. And it said, well, you shouldn't because, you know, women are unqualified. But he also said, it was something, I'm paraphrasing that word, unqualified, but that's essentially what they're saying. But he said that women would withhold intercourse from their husbands if they had this political power over their husbands. And I was just like, whoa. And this was like in 1869, I believe, that was written. It might have been 1868, but, you know, as they were discussing the issue of the 15th Amendment. So, yeah. Anyone else?
Mike, was there anything named for Ward here locally?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. What's that? Oh, the fourth word. Yeah, that's good. No. So, that's one thing that's really interesting, and part of the reason why he's forgotten, because many things were not named for him. There was actually Fort Ward. It was a Fort Ward. There was a base. A military base, training facility, I should say, for African Americans during the Civil War. That was named for Ward. Camp Ward, that's what it was, Camp Ward. And that was in the Detroit area. And it was because of his support of the Union and opposition to slavery. So it was named for him. But it had a short life. One place that does have something named for Ward is outside of Toledo. There's a place called Ward's Canal. Ward had a facility in Ohio, near Toledo, and there was a huge stand of timbered property, yet there was a marsh in between that and the lake. And so he had a 3-mile canal dug that was 30 feet wide, I think, and 3 miles long. And that's called Ward's Canal, and it's still in place today. And that was another one of the trips that I took to check that out and to see that. And it was really cool to be able to see that.
He really had a home here. Was he just an occasional visitor, or was it more of his son's presence here?
It was occasional visitor, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, his son was here, but it turns out that all of his boys were ne'er-do-wells. He did not prepare them. Once he said, they just want to fly a kite and spend my money, is a comment that he made. But I would argue it's because he was an absent father and he didn't prepare them well. And so his son was here for a couple of years, but it just didn't work out. And so he had other people that eventually ran the facilities here. And so he was just an occasional visitor. His main home was in Detroit. He also had one outside of Toledo. He had a home there that was beautiful, I guess. But it was mainly Detroit. Yeah. Probably have time for one more question.
Very interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. Really appreciate it.